but that's the way it is.
We're about to begin the services for Mrs. Lillian Kaufer. My name is Susan Winkelstein, and I'm a funeral director with Chicago Jewish Funerals. Officiating at the service is Rabbi Joseph Ozarowski. Rabbi.
I'm going to begin the service with the recitation of some verses from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Scripture, specifically from the book of Proverbs, and you'll understand why I chose these verses when you hear them. I'm going to recite them first in Hebrew and then in English. Eshes chayal miyimtza v'racha b'pnimi michra, batach balev bala v'shalol lo yachzor. Kamlasu tov v'lo ra kol yamei chayeha, Kappa parsa leoni v'yodeha shilcha la'evyon, noda basharim bala b'shivto em ziknei aretz, oz yodor levusha v'tischak li'om acharon. Piha pascha b'chachma v'saras chesed al shona, tzavi alichos beisav lechamatlos lo sochel, komo v'nel v'yashrua bala v'yhalala, rabos monos osuchel v'yatolis al kulana. Sheker achein devel ayofi shayiras aronai hisis halal, Tunulami priyodel v'haluga v'sharim ma'aseha. A woman of valor who can find, for her worth is far above precious rubies and jewels. The heart of her family safely trusts in her, and they have no lack of gain. She does good and not evil all the days of her life. She stretches out her hands to the poor and reaches forth to the needy. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the law of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and eats not the bread of idleness. Her family rises up and calls her blessed, saying, Many daughters have done valiantly, but you excel above them all. For grace by itself is deceitful, and beauty of itself vain. But a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Therefore give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. As we gather together to offer a final and fond farewell to Honey, as she was known, we have to ask ourselves, how does one sum up a long and rich life, 101, more than that, years? How does one do that? And I'm reminded of the story in the Talmud and rabbinic literature. The story itself was told some 1800 years ago of two ships. This is a parable, of course. Two ships were in the dock. One ship was leaving and one ship was coming in. And there were people who were watching this phenomenon as one ship was beginning to come out on its voyages, beginning to leave, laden with cargo, and one ship returning from its various ports of call. And there were people who noticed that the folks at the dockside were cheering the ship. They were praising the ship that was returning, but the ship that was leaving did not have any words of praise. Some of these spectators wondered, what's the meaning of this spectacle? And this is what they were told. That the ship that is returning left its port, delivered its goods, took on new goods, dropped its passengers off, took off new passengers, and has now returned to its home port safely. The ship that is leaving, we hope for the best, but we don't know what its fate will be. So too, the rabbis teach us that when the birth of a new baby is a time for joy and a time for hope, we hope for the best, but we don't know what this baby will be. We just hope it will grow into a good and fine and upstanding moral adult. But when somebody returns his or her soul to the Creator, then it's time for praise, it's time for remembrance, and it's time for reflection on a life well lived. I'm going to call on Dean on behalf of the family, and following Dean Stewart on behalf of the family will share with us some thoughts via Zoom.
nobody minds, I'm going to take off my mask, okay? First of all, I want to thank all my family and friends who are here and who supported me so many years. I worked with my parents, my partner Jerry, more recent in this process, my brother, of course, my cousins Roger, Sid, Tracy, and their families, my wonderful children, Sophie and Eli. Eli's right there. They visited my mom and were very patient with her in her later years, where she repeated herself a number of times, her questions, her stories, but they hung in there. She really loved you both. It was just wonderful. Their moms, dear moms, Jeannie Werpsa and Carol Reese there. My dear friends who are family, Joanne, Jim and Rich, Shisha and Tony, Beth and Susan, Warren, Glenn, Sandra, Karen and Pat, Melissa, Rob and Bruno, Stuart in San Francisco, Judy, Rita in Seattle, my dear friend Tim in LA, Armando, Kevin, Janet, Linda Nolan and her sister. They're both here, next door neighbors for years, really close to my mom. Thank you. Thank you all for your loving kindness and compassion. My mom was shaped by many events and circumstances in her life. She was the daughter of Jewish immigrants who came to the U.S. from Hungary, hoping for a better life here. And they were fleeing anti-Semitism and discrimination. And that theme kind of comes up again in my mother's life. My mother was very influenced by her mother. She almost had an idealized relationship with her, but her mother had a wonderful heart, a very loving soul, did many acts of kindness. When my mother's best friend, whose mother was severely mentally ill, my mother would help Rosie. Rosie and her siblings ended up in a Jewish orphanage for a while. But when Rosie was the high school valedictorian, my grandmother made her dress so she could have a dress to wear at the... But it was hard for my mother. Her mother died when she was 16 years old, and that was a long-lasting trauma for her. Then she also experienced the death of her beloved younger sister, Curly, who died at 44 years old, and then a niece, Rochelle, she was very close to, also died at 44 years old. So there was these themes of loss for her. My mother wasn't a particularly religious person, but she embodied the Jewish values. And some reflections about that. She valued connection. She really nurtured family and friendships. Even though she and her sisters would fight, and her brothers and this and back and forth, they really loved each other at the end of the day. It was quite wonderful. My mother really was a creative person. I don't know how many people really saw that, but she took great pride, great, in her cooking. Strudel, mandel bread, chicken soup, briskets, potato latkes, pogaches, which is a Hungarian Jewish cookie, pull-apart coffee cake that Linda Nolan makes to this day. So stuffed cabbage, pies, the list goes on. And she also didn't limit herself to just the immigrant cooking. She learned to cook with puff pastry. She made eclairs. She was just so creative, and she really had an eye and the hands for things without always following recipes. I would watch her in amazement. But they're funny things because she and her sisters were competitive about cooking. So one Rosh Hashanah, I can remember both my mother and my aunt would bring the desserts to my Aunt Curly's home, And these women, they didn't come with dainty little plates, with 6 cookies on a tray. They brought platters, they walked in with platters of food. This was, you'd think they were all starving, like we all were. This was like they hadn't eaten in months, but this is how they did it. And so there was always a little competition between my Aunt Helen and my mother. And my Aunt Helen's husband, he liked to give his wife jabs. So one Rosh Hashanah, he said, honey's, they called it delkalach. Honey's delkalach are so much better than yours, Helen, and yours are so dry. Well, I think we almost had a war at that Rosh Hashanah. It almost was the end, But anyway, that was some of the stories. My mother loved to garden. We lived in Lincolnwood, right next door to Linda and Nancy. She raised roses, lilacs, geraniums, peonies, tulips, tomato plants. I mean, she just really... She's so invested in that. My mother learned to drive after her father died. I was 5, 6, 7, something. And so she learned to drive because we were living in Lincolnwood and, there wasn't good public transportation. She eventually had a red Chevy Impala convertible that she used to drive around in. Roger reminded me how she used to take us for ice cream in this red Impala. So it was just funny about her, let's see, she was she wasn't somebody made clothes, but she embroidered and did needlepoint and made a beautiful blanket that my brother has for her nieces. She made centerpieces for showers and wrote these beautiful little poems. And my father was more extroverted. He liked to have... So he'd want to have a New Year's Eve party, and she would go to great length, not only cooking the whole meal, but the decorating of the table was so important to her. My mother was an avid reader, 6 to 7 books a week. It was kind of remarkable. She loved to go to libraries. And I know when I go to concerts at the Old Town School of Folk Music, the old building there was the old Hill Library, and I can sit there and think about and picture my mother and my brother and I walking through the stacks of the library. Just a wonderful memory and so important to her. And thinking back, I was always, what was she reading? All these things, often about immigrant families, Jewish sometimes, most times, working out whatever she was dealing with or interested in. But she also read like The House on Mango Street, Toni Morrison. One day I was as nosy as I could be, so I went into her book bag. I was like, what's she reading now? I had to know. And so there it was, Doris Lessing, The Golden Notebook. Who knew, that she... And then Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which later for me would be an important book. The value of literacy was so important to her. After my brother and I were out of the house, she volunteered at a Chicago public school as a teacher's aide, and she loved that work. And it really, the kids and the teachers really valued her. My mother and I had a lot of time together because my brother went to college, and my father worked a lot, so we had dinner a lot during high school. Then my dad died in 2000, and so I saw her a lot. And she had outlived all the siblings. It was a source of great sadness for her. She was the only one, the last leaf on the tree. That was, she always say, the last leaf on the tree. I said, I know, Mom, So what would we do together? Well, we watched cooking shows a lot. She just loved those shows. She learned from Martha Stewart, Jacques Pepin, Ina Garten. It wasn't like she was making what they made, but she loved technique. So, or she would buy some equipment, So one day, I went to see her, and she had a microplane for me. She said, "Well, you got a great with a microplane. This is what you do now. It's better than." So I have a microplane, right, Jerry? We're great with a microplane. as I said, she was just so talented in cooking. She had a double oven. I can have these images of her pulling a turkey out of this oven and this out of that oven, and just quite remarkable. Sadly, when she began to cook less, she lost interest and was kind of depressed. We would go out to eat some, and that was always fun. And she also let me make meals, and she had this curiosity. My father was more judgmental about, vegetarian, all that, and she was more curious and interested in how these things all work together. And I did cook one of her favorite. This isn't going to appeal to everybody, but it's like hummus, a lima bean dip. It's a Hungarian thing, very delicious. She said I made it well too, so I can feel good about that. But we had our struggles too. We both were stubborn. She needed help more at the end when she was living on her own, and of course I thought I knew best and she thought she knew best, so you know what that looks like. And when my father died, she was very sad and depressed, so I had a brilliant idea. I said, we'll go get family therapy, she and I. She had a lot to work out, I felt, what did I... So we go to the Council for the Jewish Elderly. My mother goes. She says maybe 3 words in the session. A very lovely social worker. She's sitting there. I'm sitting there. It was just, we go out into the car. And my mother was she was wonderful in saving money. My father was a spender. So we got in the car and she looked at me and she said, "And how much did that cost?" And I was so pissed, and I said, "Well, Medicare paid for it, so you don't have to worry." But the next day we were fine. It was funny that way. She didn't process a lot, kept it inside. But the other sadness for her is she came from a family that had experienced shame and fear. Her oldest sister eloped and married out of the faith, and the other Jewish families that they knew back in Europe, that they all lived at Grand and Damon, they shunned my grandparents, and my grandmother used to no longer sit on the front porch, would sit on the back porch, and my mother, that was always a source of sadness. We eventually were able to talk about some of it. I think we made some peace. She embraced me more about some things, and certainly my kids. She just adored Sophie and Eli, so I'm so grateful about that outcome. Later in life, she had a series of small strokes, TIAs, leaving her with a lot of short-term memory problems. But however, she watched the news, and she followed what was going on in the world. So it came to the election in 2016, and she really wanted to vote for Hillary Clinton. So she said, come over, and I'm voting at Self-Help Home. And I went with her. And again, that theme, we sat, and she said, well, my mother died in the 30s. I wonder what she would think of this woman president and how it would be so remarkable to her. She also saw, sadly, the resurgence of anti-Semitism, and it troubled her. She worried about the world, the terrible violence, brought back memories for her of her younger days. And then COVID hit. My mother was sick with COVID. She really never bounced back. She wasn't the same. The self-help home where she lived shut down. I couldn't visit any longer. I had a couple outdoor visits, but of course then the cold weather came and they had more COVID. So she got sick a week ago today. She was unresponsive, and they granted me visits. And in her own way, even at the end, she helped me process her loss. She lived till Friday, and I was able to see her lots of times, and it was so relieving after months and months and months of not being able to see her. So I guess I just want to end with a couple of tributes to my mother, to everyone here. And I would say, in thinking about her, a few points: go out and read a good book, cherish it like she valued literature. cook a delicious meal or bake some wonderful treats, particularly for a friend. In the spring, plant some beautiful flowers. And lastly, my mother had a lot of empathy for people, for neighbors, for friends. She helped them, tried to help them. So do something kind for a family member, someone in your community. And I thank you. Blessings to my mother and all of you. And then my brother Stuart, my older brother Stuart, is somehow going to speak. This is through.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I can't be there. That's just another humiliation of this pandemic. Sitting next to me is my partner, Addison, who's helped me through this a great deal. Dean really summed up everything and told stories that I had actually forgotten. An update on the cooking, I still have the double oven. It's melted our cabinets here in New York, but I still have it and use it all the time. And I have a lot of the artifacts that she used to keep on the stove. I have to thank Dean. His life has been so disrupted in so many big and small ways over the last 20 some years, with my dad being sick and my mom. So without Dean, my mom would never have had the life that she had. So I have to thank him. And thank you all. I'm sorry I couldn't be there.
This COVID has done such a number on all of us in so many different ways, where loved ones can't be with their loved ones at times like this, where loving children have to devolve the responsibilities to other loving children, and people can't be together at a funeral, and we have to talk through masks and stay socially distant, so many different things. And yet we're doing the best we can. We're here to pay tribute to Honey. It's appropriate, I think, to say goodbye to her today, this week. This is the week before Passover. And while I wasn't in her home in earlier days, Dean and Stuart can certainly fill us in what she probably would have been cooking this week to prepare for the Passover Seders. I'm guessing it would have included matzo ball soup, brisket, yep, and probably other interesting and good things as well. Those are memories to hold within us at a time like this, in the cold, in the chilly wind, the impending snow. Now it's always hard for me as a rabbi to offer thoughts and words coming after the beautiful thoughts of two loving children. And this is the point where the rabbi usually says, well, I never had the pleasure of knowing her or anybody in her family. I didn't know Honey, but I actually know both of her kids. I know both Dean and Stuart. I've had the honor and pleasure of professionally working with both of them. Stuart back at NYU Medical Center when he was doing social work there, and I was the Jewish chaplain. We had our fetch sessions together, right, Stuart? And Dean here in Chicago after we moved here 20 years ago, and I did some work with Horizon Hospice where he was working at the time. And I think it's to her credit, and your father's as well, when somebody turns out to be a loving, compassionate, healing person, it may have come from the parents or it may not have come from the parents, but when both children, when both sons enter a profession that involves healing and relationships and connection, that has to come in some way from the home. That has to come from your mom. Your dad too, but I didn't have any connection with him. But it shows. It shows. And one of the things that we know, especially at a time like this where there is so much trauma and so much stress going on, is that one of the ways that we cope is by trying to find ways to show gratitude. This is proven. It's actually in the literature that showing gratitude can be a healing process and keep us focused when everything else is chaotic around us. And because it's Passover, I discovered there's actually a way to do it. If you're familiar with the Passover Seder, you may recognize this actually. It's a song which begins the second half of the Seder, which is actually an exercise in gratitude. And the song is an exercise in gratitude. And I'm going to sing just one line of it because some of you will recognize it. Die, die, yenu, die, die, yenu, die, die, yenu, die, yenu, die, yenu. It's been popularized in American culture by many singers, not all of whom were Jewish. And the reason is because the word dayenu means it would have been enough. The song itself is a litany of all the things that happened to our ancestors, the various miracles that occurred when the Jewish people were freed from slavery in Egypt several thousand years ago. And the song says, if God would have only done one of those things, dayenu, the word means it would have been enough. That's what the word dayenu means. And so I think we can maybe frame this moment here as we stand shivering in the cold. If Honey only got through the tragic loss at age 16 and the various other losses in her life, dayenu. If she only raised her kids with a sense of Jewish and general values, dayenu would have been enough. If she remained loyal to Jewish tradition and culture, which she and her husband brought from the shtetl in Hungary, dayenu, that would have been enough. If all she had was food and holidays and family and trying to bring that immigrant experience to the U.S., knowing that there was family left in Europe who was lost, dayenu, that would have been enough. If all she did was loved her books and the quiet time and the value of education and friends and neighbors, dayenu, that would have been enough. If all she had was the sense of relationship building and connection and raising two wonderful sons with compassion and healing, dayenu, that would have been enough. If all she had was the interest in the news and the parts of the news that helped her hope and work for a better world, dayenu, that would have been enough. If all she had was the 60 plus years of marriage, dayenu, that would have been enough. We could go on and on and on. And all of us who knew her can find our own dayenus, our own things for which we can feel thanks and gratitude, the things that we can certainly take with us as we say goodbye. In preparing for today, I found a poem in my files that I'd like to read with you. It's called The Rose Beyond the Wall. The author is A.L. Frink, and I don't know who A.L. Frink was. But the poem is lovely, and I'm going to read it here, especially right now where we're waiting for spring, and we thought we had it last week, and we didn't. And this is a poem that can give us a sense of hope. It goes like this. Near a shady wall, a rose once grew, budded and blossomed in God's free light, watered and fed by the morning dew, shedding its sweetness day and night. As it grew and blossomed fair and tall, slowly rising to loftier height, it came to a crevice in the wall, through which there shone a beam of light. Onward it crept with added strength, with never a thought of fear or pride. It followed the light through the crevice's length and unfolded itself on the other side. The light, the dew, the broadening view were found the same as they were before, and it lost itself in beauties new, breathing its fragrance more and more. Shall claim of death cause us to grieve, and make our courage faint and fall? Nay, let us have faith and hope receive. The rose still grows beyond the wall, scattering fragrance far and wide, just as it did in days of yore, just as it did on the other side, just as it will forevermore. It's times like this that we can affirm the traditional Jewish belief, even if not all of us believe it, and that's not our concern today. We're not going to resolve the theological question. But the Torah and our tradition teaches us that when our journey ends on this earth, the journey of the soul somehow continues into a realm that we don't fully know and understand, and I've never been there to come back and tell you about it. But somewhere out there, the neshama, the soul, the animating spirit, the piece of humanness that God gives us still somehow remains. Her body's at rest. Her soul returns to the Creator, to God, in a journey that we can't fully fathom. But at the same time, the memories, the love, the connection, the experiences, the relationships are still there. They still remain with us here in our brains and here in our hearts as well. And they can never be taken away by any power on this earth. May her soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. At this moment, we offer our condolences to Stuart and Addison, to Dean and Jerry, to Sophie and Eli, to all of you, neighbors, friends of the family who are here with us, and those who are online watching on Zoom. We're going to take a moment now of silent remembrance and prayer, following which we'll begin the burial, and I will explain what that will be in a moment.
can use the cups over here.
Dear friends, the burial is considered an integral part of the Jewish funeral service, and under normal circumstances, we would be inviting everybody to participate in the burial. It's considered a mark of honor and a way of saying goodbye to the deceased to participate. And under normal circumstances, we would fill the hole to the top, or maybe halfway, or maybe a couple of inches. But we're living in a time without normal circumstances, and as we just confirmed, the rule of the cemetery is that they're not allowing us, meaning the participants, the mourners, to use shovels. What we can do and what we will do is we have buckets and small cups, if you're not up to using a bucket, to at least put some earth into the grave. At least in some symbolic way we can participate in this part of the burial. You're invited to do this if you feel emotionally and physically up to it. Following giving everybody the chance to participate, we will offer the final prayers.
There's a little paper cups over there. And we set it up the same in order to you guys put in some like a,
That's like the garbage can.
yeah, this is for the
For
garbage.
the cups, yeah.
More cups, yes, that's all.
So just take the little plastic cup.
Little plastic cups, if you'd like to line up over here.
And then there's the actual looser earth in here, bucket.
They are right under the cup. They say they're gonna start snowing. That's why it's like- So
everybody who's wanted has had their chance to put a little bit of earth into the grave. Please, right now. We can all gather together just for another minute. We're going to offer the concluding prayers. There are two prayers we're going to recite. One is actually in your booklets if you'd like to follow along. It's the 23rd Psalm, which we're going to recite in Hebrew and in English. Then we will recite the memorial prayer. I'm going to recite it first in Hebrew. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai ro'yu lo echsar binos deshe yarbitsen amei menuchos yenahaleni, nafshi yishavi v'nchini v'maglei tzedek l'ma'an shemo, gam ki elech v'getz hamavas lo yirah ki atam yadi, shivtcha mishantech lahemi enachamuni, tarch l'fanai shulchan neged sororoi, tishanti v'Hashem en roshi kosi revayach tov v'chesed yirifuni kol yemei chayoi, v'shabti v'veis Adonai liorech yomim. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy me shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I'm going to recite now the memorial prayer. I'm going to chant it in Hebrew and then read it in English. Eloha shlichos kanun v'rachu emerech apayim v'rav chesed hamsei kaporas pesha ve'akrovas yesha u'menucha nechona tachas kanfei hashechina b'malos kedoshim u'tehorim kezarakia mazrim es nishmas ha'isha chaya blima bas Shmuel v'Rachel shalcha li'olama Hona bal harachmim zachar l'v'ho v'kol zich Yosef v'tzik Yosef v'artzos ha'chayim Upsachla shari tzedek v'yora shari chem l'v'chanina v'seisek anafecha tastireh li'olamim utzor b'tzor chaimes nishmasa aray v'nachalasa v'senuach b'shalom mishkava v'nomar Amen. O God of forgiveness, gracious and compassionate, grant proper rest beneath the sheltering wings of your presence among the holy and pure who shine as the brightness of the heavens unto the soul of Chaya Blima, daughter of Shmuel and Rachel, Lillian Kaufer, who has gone to her eternal rest. Master of mercy, remember her for good, her righteousness and her attributes in the lands of the living. Open for her the gates of light, of compassion and grace. Bring her under the cover of your presence forever and bind her soul in the bonds of eternal life. May God be your possession, may her repose be peace, and let us all say, Amen. This concludes the service at the cemetery. Thank you all for being here. We conclude with offering our words of condolence to the immediate family, the traditional Hebrew words, Hamakom Yenachem Eschem B'Sochrei V'Litzion B'Yerushalayim. In English, may God, who is everywhere, comfort you among the other mourners for Zion and Jerusalem. May we be together in the future for happier occasions. Amen.
I would just like to add that for those of you online and for those of you present, you can certainly log on to Chicago Jewish Funerals website or legacy.com to share your personal condolences and stories with the family. Take care.